If you'll remember, last week we began talking about some of the basics of how we measure the macroeconomy. I don't want you to focus on how those numbers are actually calculated. I just want you to know just the basic ideas of what GDP is, unemployment, inflation, and those things. So don't focus on the math at all. Today in chapter 20, we're going to talk about economic growth and development. We will talk about what it is, as well as how we measure it and how do we foster economic development. So if you'll remember from at the beginning of the semester, in chapter 1, we talked about the production possibilities frontier and the idea that economic growth is represented by a shift outwards of the production possibilities frontier. And when that shifts outwards, essentially what it means is we're able to produce more of everything, more goods and services. And so economic growth is just that idea that we can produce more goods and services. Economic development is a little bit different. It's a little bit broader perspective of an economy. It includes more aspects of an economic system. It looks at infrastructure levels, education, healthcare, political systems, and essentially when we talk about economic development, we talk about increasing or enhancing those broader systems within a country. So if you'll remember, we talked about 3 different levels of development. The lesser developed countries were primarily centered in sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit in Southeast Asia. They tend to be those that have lower levels of economic activity. The emerging markets tend to be centered in Asia, as well as South America and even in Central America. These emerging markets are getting a leg up. They're beginning to rise on the economic ladder. You'll remember we talked about 4 special countries that we've identified within an acronym called BRIC. So do you remember what the BRIC countries are? B stands for Brazil. And we have Russia, India, and China. Those 4 countries have risen on the economic ladder and typically have gained quite a bit of economic development in recent years. So we classify them as emerging. We also have the developed economies, primarily centered in Europe, as well as North America. Japan and Australia are isolated over there in the Pacific region, but they are very strong economies also. So we're going to look at how we actually achieve economic growth. And at the beginning of this chapter, you'll notice there's several graphs. There's mathematical description of how to achieve economic growth. And I really don't want you to focus on the graphs. I don't want you to worry about the math, but I just want you to understand the basic ideas. So in an economy, if we're producing goods and services, that means that somebody is consuming goods and services. And so we'll talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is essentially just, excuse me, looking at all of the individual demand for goods and services and combining them all together. And we'll look at the individual businesses that are supplying things and just aggregate them all together. So aggregate supply and aggregate demand just sort of pulls together or aggregates everybody's demand and supply for individual products and services. So if we want to increase aggregate demand, one of the ways that we can do that is simply to instill a little bit more consumer confidence. When consumers lack confidence, they tend not to desire to go out and buy things. And obviously, then businesses aren't going to be producing things if the consumers aren't going to be buying them. So, on a micro level, for example, if you've been following the news at all, since February, airline travel has decreased dramatically. And because of that, people are just lacking confidence in aircraft travel, and therefore airline ticket sales have been going down. And because airplane ticket sales have been going down, the orders for new aircraft have also been going down. So the businesses are really not out there making more aircraft because there really isn't a demand for new airplanes right now. So we really just don't have the confidence to purchase a new aircraft. And so businesses such as Boeing have had to lay off workers. So as consumer confidence increases, we typically have an increase in aggregate demand. You can also increase your aggregate demand through government spending. If the government were to go out and begin purchasing more things and desiring to buy more things, that would increase our aggregate demand. The challenge with that, of course, is the government can't do it all. The government has to pay for things. And obviously, if a government can't pay for things, eventually they're going to have problems if they want to achieve economic growth by government spending. Eventually they're going to run into a problem because they have to borrow all that money from somebody. And if they just keep running up the debt, eventually people decide they really don't want to loan the money anymore to the government. Now, that's a much more detailed topic that we would talk about in a macroeconomics class. But around the world, governments are running into challenges in their how much they have in debt. That's become quite a challenge, especially for countries that are lesser developed or emerging markets. Another way that you could increase aggregate demand is just to somehow allow people to have more money to spend. And you might do that by decreasing their taxes. So if you decrease their taxes, people have more money to spend, therefore they might go out more and purchase items. Obviously, decreasing taxes and increasing government spending are really not a sustainable way to achieve economic growth. We also really can only achieve economic growth if we have both an increase in aggregate demand and an increase in aggregate supply. You can't really sustain that economic growth if it's just on the aggregate demand side. We actually need businesses to be able to produce more goods and services. And one of the key ways that we can increase our aggregate supply is through increasing worker productivity. Now, this does not mean that workers work more hours. It means that what they do in their hours is more productive. And one of the key ways that we can increase productivity is through training and education. And these have quite an impact in the lesser developed world. As they increase their levels of education, their aggregate supply tends to increase much faster than in the developed world. I often tell my class to consider this. Which do you suppose has the most impact on a person's life? If you think on the margin, just incrementally, what has the most impact on a person's life? Learning to read and put sentences together, just even the basic alphabet and sentences, versus going from reading an advanced chapter book to, let's say you're going to read an Algebra 2 book versus a calculus book, which had more impact on your life? Probably learning to read. If you went from not knowing anything to at least knowing how to read, think about how that's going to impact your life versus, knowing the difference between algebra and calculus may not have as much impact on your life as just basic reading levels. So oftentimes, training and education has a much larger impact on the lesser developed world because they're learning to do things for the very first time. So they're going from 0 to 1 as opposed to at higher levels. There's a phrase that sometimes 0 to 1 is a much larger distance than 99 to 100. You can also think about if we're going to produce more goods and services, increase aggregate supply, one way to achieve that might be to obtain more capital. And we can provide some incentives for businesses to invest in capital equipment by simply making it cheaper to do that. Maybe give them some tax breaks on their capital investments. If we look around the world at what's been happening, I like this visualization. In 2020, obviously, economic growth has declined around the world. They're estimating that we will lose about 3% of our economic activity this year. The hope is that next year it will rebound and still continue to grow. You'll notice, however, if we make a distinction between the advanced economies and the lesser developed and emerging economies, you'll notice that 2020 has hit the advanced economies much harder. And again, the way that I like to put this, it's a harder fall from the top of the ladder than from the bottom of the ladder. If you're at the bottom of the ladder, you're dropping one rung, and it might not really impact you as much as if you're at the top of the ladder. And so 2020 has been very hard on the advanced economies of the world, the developed economies, not as much of an impact on the lesser developed economies. But you'll also notice that the hope is that next year, economic growth actually is going to rebound quite well in the developing and the emerging markets, even more so than in the advanced economies. Again, imagine you've now fallen off the ladder, but you were only one rung up. So going from the ground floor to the first or second rung of a ladder is a much greater impact than going from at the very top of the ladder and climbing a rung. But we sort of need to look at the bigger picture. GDP tells one part of the story, but the bigger picture is the reality of what's behind those GDP figures. We really want to look at what's that GDP actually composed of. Now, your book presents a table, and I'm not going to ever ask you specifics on memorizing all the details of those tables, but get a general picture, general sense by looking at the columns of that table. If you look at GDP by sector, you'll notice that the advanced economies of the world typically are a little bit more diverse. They have industry, they have some agriculture, they have a lot of services, and they're typically very diverse economies. Those economies at the bottom of the table, you'll notice, are very heavy in agriculture. That's a defining characteristic of lesser developed economies, that they typically depend on agriculture. Now, if you'll remember where those economies are often located, they're located in regions of the world that the environment often doesn't work in their favor for agriculture. They might have a lot of monsoons or droughts. They might not really have land that is very sustainable for agriculture. And so that presents a problem for a lesser developed economy. They might not even be able to feed themselves. As you climb the ladder, however, you'll notice some emerging markets, for example, Brazil, might become very dependent on particular resources. For example, if a country discovers oil, so for example, Nigeria has an awful lot of oil, but it's very dependent on oil. And so its economic growth has been driven by oil. When the price of oil goes down, what do you suppose happens to economic growth in the country of Nigeria? It also goes down because they're so dependent upon the oil sector. So the more diverse economies typically are those at the top of the ladder. Your advanced economies tend not to be solely dependent upon one sector or even just agriculture. There's some other things that we want to look at. If we look at income distribution in a country, we might realize that while Nigeria, for example, has a lot of oil, the income that's generated from that is not really equitably distributed. You tend to have a great deal of poverty. So in those lesser developed economies, there's a great deal of poverty, and what wealth there is distributed really to the top class. You have a wide difference between the top, the wealthiest, and the poorest. There's a big gap. So countries will measure their distribution of income by using what's known as a Gini index. You do not need to calculate this or memorize numbers, but in general, just remember that if a Gini index is approaching 1, that's a sign of perfect inequality. If a Gini index is approaching 0, that's a sign that there's more equitable distribution of income. So the developed countries of the world tend to have numbers that are closer to 0. For example, the United States, Canada, many of the European countries might have Gini indexes that actually are less than 0.4 or 0.3. And many of the developing countries of the world tend to have Gini indexes in the 0.6 range. So that would mean there's a lot of inequality in their income distribution. We also might want to look at inflation and unemployment. You might have a high GDP, but also a high level of unemployment, such as the United States has been experiencing in 2020. That's really hit our economy pretty hard. Other countries of the world may not have had as high a GDP, but they really didn't lose many jobs. They don't have a lot of unemployment going on. And so many countries in Africa actually have an unemployment rate in the 6, 7, 8% range. We also might want to look at the reality that not all political structures are the same, and different countries have different levels of education and healthcare. So for example, the United States has a very large GDP and China has a very large GDP. However, our political structures are very different. Our infrastructures are very different. Our healthcare systems are very different. So while China may have a very large GDP, it has some other things that are actually lending itself to more instability. So when we look at economic development and desiring to climb the ladder, there's several challenges to overcome. One, I believe, probably is extremely important, has to do with education. In many of the lesser developed and even the emerging markets, you have very low literacy rates. People literally just can't read. And oftentimes education in some of those economies tends to be focused on the males as opposed to females. So there's not really an equitable distribution of the education that actually is there. Sometimes the challenge with that is in the lesser developed countries, they might need the children to actually work in the fields as opposed to going to school. And so that presents a challenge for economic development. You might have very little infrastructure. I remember reading a story about a farmer in the country of Laos in Southeast Asia, and he was able to grow a crop. It was a type of lettuce that he was growing, and he grew enough that he wanted to take it to the farmer's market in the next village over. There really weren't any roads through the jungle. He pulled a cart through the jungle, essentially. But in the time that he was traveling, it was the rainy season, and his cart essentially fell off the side of a mountain because the dirt path that he was on was all eroded and muddy, and he lost control essentially of his crop. And that's what he had to live on. And it disappeared because they didn't even have roads to get to market. Another problem in growing an economy and economic development has to do with political instability. Many of the lesser developed and even the emerging markets have political structures in which there's quite a bit of instability. For example, Brazil recently had elections that they're claiming there was some fraud in those elections, that some of the individuals that the people had voted to be on the ballot, the government decided was not allowed to be on the ballot. And so they didn't even get a chance to vote among the people that they wanted to vote among. So you might have political instability within a country, and that's hard to overcome, as is corruption. And this may be governmental corruption. It might also be businesses, corrupt business practices. But in many of the lesser developed economies of the world, there is quite a bit of corruption that's involved. I know oftentimes businesses that want to do business with other countries might build into their prices a little bit of extra money to deal with bribery. So for example, if you were a business from the United States that wanted to sell a product in another country, you might actually have to even just bribe the port officials to allow your loads to be loaded off of the ships. And so those bribes actually might be built into the price, which makes it very hard to do business in other countries. You also have several countries, lesser developed countries, in which the central bank really has no ability to influence the macroeconomy. For example, the Bank of Zimbabwe actually, back in 2009, I believe it was, lost their ability to influence the money supply in that country. It actually was a bank that was not allowed to print money. Their currency system collapsed due to hyperinflation. And it's often thought that that hyperinflation was caused or started really because of corruption within that country. So if a central bank cannot enter into the economy and help stabilize an economy, you have a great challenge to overcome. You also have countries where you might be able to sell things, but you might not be able to convert that currency back into your own currency. So for example, if you were a US country that was doing business in Zimbabwe back in 2008, you might be receiving Zimbabwe dollars for the sale of your goods, but you would have a really hard time converting the Zimbabwean dollar back to a US dollar. So why bother doing business in Zimbabwe if you couldn't convert it back into your own country's currency? So these are all problems that countries have to overcome when they desire to achieve economic development. And these are rather big hurdles to overcome. So in general, what we've talked about is the idea of economic growth and development. And we've realized that some countries seem to be able to grow really well, and some countries seem to be struggling. There are some hurdles to overcome. Now, I will also post a video that describes a visualization of the 200 countries of the world and how they've grown through time over the last 200 years. And I really like that video because it demonstrates that it wasn't but 200 years ago that most of the world was at the bottom of the economic ladder. And some countries have grown better than others. Some countries have grown faster than others. And so I'm going to encourage you to watch that video. I can't post that video within this recording. Teams doesn't let me make a recording of another recording. So you'll find that video attached after this video. But I really encourage you to watch that just to see the visualization. But just remember, gross domestic product doesn't tell the whole story. There's more to it than that. There's healthcare, there's education, there's the political structures, there's infrastructure. Some countries have done a pretty good job of overcoming those hurdles, and they have risen on the economic ladder. And some countries have really struggled to overcome those hurdles. There really isn't an easy answer for how to overcome the hurdles. Every country is unique, and every country has a unique history. And it's also important to understand that while a country may have risen, a country can also fall. I like to point out that, for example, the country of Egypt at one time, the country of China at one time, the country of India at one time. These were all countries that were at the top of the economic ladder at one time, and yet they all fell for a variety of reasons. So if you look at world history, you'll see countries rising and falling. In recent years, we have had some pretty good economic growth, and there's the hope that we can bring everybody, all countries, up to a little bit higher standard if we can just figure out how to overcome these last hurdles. In the next chapter, we'll begin looking at international trade and how that has helped to facilitate the growth of economies around the world. So please try to keep up with the videos and the reading and the assignments that are posted in Blackboard.